to our third session of real research in South Africa. Everybody on this group is a researcher in one way or another, but it's wonderful to have the professional researchers on our sessions today. And Shirley, I'm thankful for, has curated this session, Shirli Gilbert, and she's going to be our speaker today. So Shirley is Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London, but as you'll hear, she's South African, and she's obviously has a great interest in this. She got her D.Lit at the University of Oxford, postdoctoral fellow at the Society of Fellows at the University of Michigan. She's published widely on the Holocaust and its legacies and Jews in South Africa. And she is editor-in-chief of Jewish Historical Studies, a journal of English-speaking Jewry. And I think she does that with Adam Mendelsohn, who's sorry he can't be with us today, as he has some urgent matters to attend to, and also apologies from our lovely friend Gail, who's not able to be with us today. But over to you, Shirley.
Thank you so much, Geraldine, for suggesting this series, which is connected to a special issue of the journal that you mentioned, Jewish Historical Studies, which was published earlier this year. And I'll say just a little bit about the journal and why we published this special issue. So it's the official journal of the Jewish Historical Society of England. And I was asked to take over the editorship and agreed to do it on the proviso that we could expand its scope to move beyond Anglo-Jewry to look at English-speaking Jewish communities worldwide. And as Geraldine said, Adam Mendelsohn then came on board as a South African representative, and we've also brought on board Avril Elba from the University of Sydney. And in order to kind of launch this expanded scope of the journal, we had our first issue this year, which was devoted to South African Jewry. And I would really encourage you to, if you're interested, have a look. We had 5 articles on various aspects of South African Jewry, 5 just general articles. And then I wrote what we called a state of the field piece, which is just to give a sense of how research on South African Jews has developed and where it is right now. And then we got responses to that piece from leading scholars in the field. And we also had some reflections from Milton Shane about the history of anti-Semitism in South Africa. We also reprinted a hugely important piece of work that was written by a doctoral student in the 1980s, but that has basically been forgotten. And the idea of this special issue was to try and revitalize some interest in the study of South African Jews, because there is so much more to be researched and so many materials available in South Africa and elsewhere. And yet, as I'll talk about a little bit more, professional historical work, academic historical work on this subject is really declining quite a lot. So I won't say too much about the special issue. I will let you explore it, and perhaps Geraldine, afterwards I'll send you the link so you can send it around to people. But what I'm going to do today is just give you a very broad brush overview of where I see the field, some of its most important debates and so on. And I'll mention some ongoing research that's happening now, including from the articles that we published, and also a little bit of my own work. And it was interesting to me, Geraldine, how you opened when you introduced me to talk about, you know, a real researcher, and that there are, of course, lots of researchers, lots of people on this group who are doing very important and valuable research, especially into small towns, places where Jews first came in South Africa. I think one of the most interesting things to me about South African Jewish history is the relationship between professional history writing and more public-focused or community-driven history work that is written or created both for and by a general audience, both South African Jews and not. And I want to emphasize that it's not that one is better or worse than the other, but they have very different aims and functions. And part of what I want to be pointing to is those different aims and functions and how that affects the relationship between them. So history is central to any group's identity. It's not surprising to me that the subject is often of great interest, not just to scholars, but to wider society. But history that's produced for a general audience or by a general audience often has more pragmatic aims. And it participates actively in a process of creating or reinforcing particular narratives or stories about a group because it's so central to group identity. So that kind of public history is often less concerned about exactly what happened, which is not to say that it invents things or that it's false. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. I think constructing narratives is inevitable. Anyone who creates any kind of history constructs a narrative. But whereas professional historians will be looking for new source materials that haven't been looked at before to maybe broaden the picture of what we know or challenge received ideas, popular history will generally be guided more by present day needs and proclivities and interests. So I'll say a little bit more about that and happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. And I should say I'll try not to take up too much time. I mean, I'll give you a talk, but I also want to leave lots of time to hear your impressions and thoughts. I should also emphasize that the line between these two modes of history writing that I've pointed out is not always clear. In fact, it's often blurred. But I think that in the case of South African Jews, it's an especially complicated relationship. And if I were to summarize the state of historical work on South African Jewry, I'd say it's really not straightforward. It's quite a checkered picture. So on the face of it, there's a lot of new interest in this subject, acknowledging, of course, that this is a niche subject. When we say lots of interest, it's not on the front page of the New York Times, but there is a fair number of new publications, exhibitions, virtual networks like this one, MA and PhD theses, and so on. But if we look more closely, the picture is much less clear. Many of the scholars who have really shaped the research on South African Jews over the past 4 or 5 decades are now reaching the end of their careers. And I'm thinking especially of people like Milton Shane, Gidi Shimoni at the Hebrew University, and so on. Also, the institutional infrastructure in South Africa for academic Jewish studies is really quite limited and challenged at the moment. The Kaplan Center, of course, is doing important work, and it's really at the center of it. But there are few active scholars who consider this to be their main area of work. Now, there is research being done by a small handful of mostly younger scholars, and I think there are some promising possibilities for the field in the coming years, but most of those scholars are based outside South Africa, and I think that reflects the dearth of local postgrad students in South Africa, which is partly related to a lack of funding for research. But I would say really many of the newest projects and a lot of the newest work is driven by non-professional historians, like people on this group who are researching small towns. And much of this work is very engaging, it's very thoughtfully produced, but it's largely disconnected from scholarly conversations and often tends to adhere to long-standing communal narratives or consensus about South African history rather than, in the way that scholarship would, interrogating received ideas, tackling unexplored archives, and so on. So while I think all of these initiatives are great and they're doing excellent work, as an academic, I'm also interested in addressing what I see as a problem for the future of South African Jewish history, which is really the lack of professional historians who are devoting themselves to it. And as you can see, this is a bit of a project for me, which is why we devoted the whole special issue of our journal to it. So in order to contextualize where the research is today, I'm going to just briefly outline how historical work on South African Jews has evolved since it began in the early 20th century. And as you'll see, this relationship between scholarly history writing and public concerns is already there from the very outset. And from that time, history writing was seen as a very important way of establishing Jews as rightful members of South African society. In other words, the writing of South African Jewish history was not seen as just a scholarly pursuit, something that we have to do because we write history, but it had an explicit purpose of showing the outside world, particularly South Africans, that Jews were not exploiters or interlopers, but that they were active participants in building South African national life. And I should say this is not a trend that's unique to South Africa. We see the same trend at this time and earlier in other Jewish communities, other Jewish diaspora communities, including in the United States and in the UK. And it's not surprising, particularly in South Africa. Jews had been experiencing anti-Semitism at the turn of the 20th century, which targeted, it was, as anti-Semitism always is, it was a multifaceted phenomenon that targeted both those poor immigrants who were arriving from Eastern Europe and the so-called landlords, the wealthy Jews who dominated diamond and gold mining industries before World War I. And in the 1930s, anti-Semitism took on even more virulent forms, not only on the radical right, with organizations like the Grey Shirts or the Ossewa Brandwacht, but also among mainstream political parties, including, of course, the National Party. So anti-Semitism is an ongoing concern for a community that's relatively new, because as we know, the vast majority of South African Jews arrived as immigrants from Lithuania at the turn of the 20th century. And here they face increasing anti-Semitism. By 1930, the Quota Act is passed, which effectively brings immigration from Lithuania to a halt. And then in 1937, the Aliens Act is passed, which closes a loophole that for a period allowed German Jews to arrive, refugees from Nazi Germany. And then the National Party wins its shock election victory in 1948. And the bottom line is Jews felt their position to be precarious. And writing history, documenting their contributions to South Africa, was seen as a really important way of challenging anti-Semitism and emphasizing Jewish loyalty to South Africa at what was a deeply uncertain time. So I hope this connection between academic history writing and this public concern that history is an important contribution to making Jews safe in South Africa and justifying the importance of their presence and their place. And as the decades progress and apartheid legislation is established and then resistance is violently suppressed in the 1960s, a lot of the work that was produced about South African Jews followed along similar lines. And we see a continued investment in what we might call contributionist narratives, which are emphasizing, as the word suggests, Jews' contributions, their positive impact on broader society. So some of you may have encountered a very large volume of essays called The Jews in South Africa that was published in 1955, just 7 years after the beginning of apartheid. And it was edited by Gustav Saren, who was the General Secretary of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies at the time, and the journalist Louis Hotz. And this book presented a very clear picture of a community that, yes, had retained its distinctiveness, but was very well integrated into South Africa, and that had played an important role in the development of the economy, in the expansion of industry. For example, it talked at length about Jewish involvement in diamond and gold mining, in the ostrich feather industry, and so on. And there's, of course, no mention in the book, no reference to South African politics or to the involvement of Jews in activism. Richard Mendelsohn and Milton Shane have suggested that the picture that this book presented, and a couple of other books that appeared around the same time, came really to be what they call the received version of the South African Jewish past. So what's that received version? An industrious, upwardly mobile, respectable, civic-minded, loyal, and uniformly Zionist community, which energetically contributes to South African society and is generally welcomed. And they say the less acceptable elements of the community's history were simply minimized or omitted from this story. So that's the kind of early contributionist historiography. What I would call serious academic research on South African Jews really began to develop during the 70s and 80s. And it came from two distinct and largely disconnected directions. One was scholars working within the framework of Jewish history and focused on Jewish communal life and identity. And here I'm thinking about scholars like the historian Gideon Shimoni, who some of you may have come across. He immigrated to Israel in 1961 and wrote really important seminal texts about South African Zionism, later about Jews during apartheid, his book titled Community and Conscience, which is highly recommended if people haven't read it yet. So there's Gideon Shimoni, there's also Ali Dab, who was an anthropologist and a sociologist, also immigrated to Israel. He left in 1978, and he produced many socio-demographic studies on South African Jews. And I would also include in this group Milton Shane, of course, who will be known to many of you, who wrote foundational texts on South African anti-Semitism, 3 volumes, the third of which just recently appeared, which looks at anti-Semitism from roughly the 1950s until the present. So this is one area of research that I would say really was the foundation of the field. But there was also a fair amount of research coming out in the 1970s and 80s that was coming from another direction, from more mainstream historians of South Africa. In fact, some of South Africa's most influential historians associated with the history workshop movement, who were producing works of social history that considered South African Jews against a wider backdrop. So the most prominent of these was Charles van Onselen. In the 1980s, he wrote a huge study which was looking at the social history of the Witwatersrand from the early development of gold mining to the outbreak of World War I. And he was interested especially in ordinary men and women, not just the big machas, as it were, but ordinary men and women, including Jews, in a rapidly industrializing Johannesburg. And part of what he did in this study, focused on ordinary people, was to shine a spotlight on, shall we say, some of the less salubrious aspects of South African Jewish life, including, for example, prostitution and black marketeering, which is a part of South African Jewish history. And also in this context, I want to mention the work of Riva Krut, and she's the PhD student I mentioned earlier. She was working in the early 1980s as a student in London under the supervision of Shula Marx, who was an extremely influential South African historian. And Krut was interested in her work in the process through which the Jewish community was forged in the early 20th century. And she thinks about community as not as a kind of natural thing that just organically emerges, but as something that is produced, constructed, created very deliberately with particular ideas. And she shows how the Jews who were running the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, leading it when it was founded in the early 1900s. These were Jews mostly of German and British origin who had been in South Africa for a few decades. That they were very concerned at that point about making Eastern European Jewish immigrants more respectable in terms of their politics and their demeanor. And that these Jews, the leaders of the board, worked very hard to establish Jews as white in South African society, which was not a foregone conclusion. And it was, in fact, a very deliberate and difficult job. Again, here I'll say that this question, this idea of Jewish immigrants to other parts of the world becoming white and not being straightforwardly white is something that we see in lots of other diaspora communities, particularly in the United States. Jews were not straightforwardly accepted as white. It's where the white but not white term comes from. It wasn't clear. And it was often something for which they had to fight. And this is something that Riva Krut really emphasizes in her work. But as I mentioned in the introduction, her work was all but forgotten. And we decided to reprint a chapter at least in this special issue on South African Jews in the hope that people would revisit it because it was excellent research. But perhaps it will not be surprising to you that the work of scholars like Krut or Van Onselen, in fact, gained very little traction within the Jewish community or among scholars who were focused on Jewish history. And it was really the scholars in the first group, people like Gidi Shimoni and Ali Dowd and Milton Shane, who came to define the field of South African Jewish history. I would just want to mention here one important exception, also who may be known to some of you, and that is the amazing, pioneering literary scholar and Yiddishist Joseph Sherman, who was also an English professor. And in fact, he taught me English at Wits when I was there many moons ago, but was also a Yiddishist. And he positioned his work on South African Jews very squarely within the tradition of activist social history. And he complained often and loudly that the community's historians had neglected Yiddish sources, partly, yes, because they couldn't read the language, but also because, in his view, they didn't like the picture of South African Jewry that they found in the Yiddish sources. And his research, which admittedly focused on a particularly difficult part of that image, focused on the so-called eating houses. Well, I won't say the worst name that was used for them, that were set up for Black mine workers and the Yiddish-speaking immigrants who worked there. And he showed, using these Yiddish sources, how immigrants often developed racist attitudes and would side with the exploiters, as he put it, because they saw here an opportunity to rise above the lot that for most Jews had been inescapable in Eastern Europe. In other words, they find themselves suddenly in South Africa on the top, well, not on the top of the racial ladder, but certainly not on the bottom of the racial ladder, and able to rise a little bit above where they had been able to be in Eastern Europe. And they did this happily and without compunction. So that's Joseph Sherman. So over the 80s, 90s, the 2000s, there's been lots of excellent, very important academic work, which I won't go into any great detail. It is indeed discussed in very great detail in my article if people want to follow up on references and links. But I'll mention scholars like first Veronica Belling, who is sitting here on our call, who's produced really important work, first on Yiddish theater, then on Jewish women who migrated to South Africa, and is currently doing some important work that I hope she will at some point talk to Chol about, but related to the Yiddish press. So generally, in terms of Yiddish in South Africa, Veronica's really made a huge contribution. Also scholars like Richard Mendelsohn, Jocelyn Hellig, Marsha Levison, Sally Frankenthal, lots and lots of others. I imagine some of these names will be familiar to you, and they cover a wide range of subjects, from portrayals of South African Jews in literature to the experiences of Israeli immigrants in South Africa, and much else besides. So I opened up saying I'm interested in this relationship between scholarly history and public history, and I'll say a little bit more now about the history aimed especially at popular audiences that I think is becoming increasingly the most active and vibrant area of work. I think we already began to see these trends starting in the late 1980s and the 1990s in the form of several exhibitions that were mounted, presenting aspects of Jewish life and history. One of these was the Anne Frank in the World exhibition. This was opened on the eve of South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994, very high-profile exhibition organized by Myra Osran. And at the Johannesburg opening, Nelson Mandela gave the public opening. It was one of his first public acts as president, so really had a high profile. Other important exhibitions, the Seeking Refuge exhibitions, which were held in the early 2000s, in Johannesburg and Cape Town, which was about celebrating the contributions of German Jewish refugees in those cities. And there were lots of other exhibitions. And here, scholars were involved in the initiatives, but they weren't driving the work. These were really communally driven initiatives. And I'll say as an aside that the Anne Frank in the World exhibition, which Myra Osran organized, was part of what convinced her of the need for a Holocaust Center in South Africa. And of course, she went on to found the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, as it's now known, which was then expanded with two further centers in Durban and in Johannesburg. So these are community-driven initiatives with some scholarly input, but they're public history initiatives. There've also been a lot of publications which are about celebrating the achievements of Jewish individuals and organizations. So here again, there's that link to the contributionist style of history, which is about focusing on the Jewish impact, and often for a very explicit purpose. And in particular, we see several projects that are focused on Jewish participation in the anti-apartheid struggle. There were two books, two beautiful coffee table books produced by the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. One was called Madiba, a tribute from South African Jewry. Another was called Jewish Memories of Mandela. And they showcased the contributions of South African Jewish activists and really emphasized, so here's a quote from one of them, emphasized that the community continues in this tradition. In other words, the South African Jewish community today continues in this tradition of contributing much more than its fair share to the welfare and advancement of South Africa in virtually every sphere of life. And I think you can hear very clearly in that quote how history is explicitly part of a wider project of emphasizing Jews' importance to South African society. Similarly, with another recent book, which some of you may see, Mentions in the Trenches, Jewish Foot Soldiers in the Anti-Apartheid Struggle, which was also commissioned by the board. And again, I'll read you a quote from the back cover that says, the book aims to pursue the board's mission to build bridges of friendship and understanding between Jews and all other peoples of South Africa, while also preserving and educating the wider public about the history of the Jewish community and the part its members have played in the unfolding story of their country. So very much about Jewish contributions. There was an 8-part historical documentary some of you may have seen called Legends and Legacies. It was first aired in July 2021, rather. It also is about the remarkable contribution that Jews have made in South Africa. And there are many, many other examples of public history publications, exhibitions, books, websites, and lively forums like this one, which are often focused on what has been the impact of Jews in South Africa. So I'll emphasize again that this growth in popular initiatives is not surprising at all to me, given the historical upheaval that this community has endured over a relatively short space of time. And I think it's clear to me, not just by observation, but also by personally having given talks, presented my work in South Africa and discussed it with audiences, it's very clear to me that how Jewish history is narrated, how South African Jewish history is narrated, is not a neutral question or an academic question in South Africa. For many Jews, it seemed to have very profound implications for Jewish life in the present. Even at its peak in the 1970s, this has always been a small community. It's now undergoing extreme demographic decline, which we heard about in the first session of this series from Raviva Hassan. And Jews' sense of precariousness means that it's quite unsurprising that many remain deeply invested in how the history of our community is portrayed. At the same time, as an academic, as I said at the beginning, I'm concerned about the lack of professional history writing, which has distinct aims and functions, which is to keep uncovering new information, to engage in open-ended research that asks questions, sometimes very uncomfortable questions, and probes and challenges what we think we know. Now, I think there are some obvious practical reasons for the decline in this kind of academic history writing. There are very few scholars working in this field today. There are very few academic courses or jobs. And the most promising scholarship is being produced by scholars outside South Africa, as I said. So I think one urgent prerequisite for the continued growth of this field is nurturing a new generation of scholars who have the necessary academic training and, crucially, the necessary languages. I still think that Yiddish, particularly, is an untapped resource. There are a huge amount of Yiddish materials, which I know Veronica would be able to attest to, that people haven't accessed, that have a lot to tell us about our community, but lots of other sources besides. And also key to this is financial support. And there are so many different issues, questions that we could be asking about South African Jewish history. I'm happy to talk about some of them. But my hope in writing the State of the Field was to, and indeed publishing the whole special issue, was to try and spur renewed interest and get people thinking about what areas could be explored and how we might support this work. So that is broadly where I see the field. I want to say just in the last few minutes a little bit about ongoing work in the field, including work that's being done by early career scholars who are either working on or just finished their PhDs, and some of whom were published in this special issue of the journal. So we've already heard in this series from Gavin Baynard-Smolin, who I believe is also on the call today, who is doing his PhD at NYU. And in our special issue, we published a great article from him on community cookbooks, very different from what he talked about last week, which is more related to his PhD research. And he looks at these many dozens, probably hundreds of community cookbooks as a fascinating source for gaining insight into the lives of South African Jewish women, which is one area of the historiography that is totally neglected. The history that we have of this community has largely overlooked women, so there's tons more to be done there. We also heard from Raviva Hassan, who's based at UCT and doing great socio-demographic research. In the special issue, we published an article by a young British scholar called William Pimlott, who recently finished his PhD at UCL and is now also in New York for a postdoc fellowship. And in his work, he tells the story of the early history of the Yiddish press in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century, and the role that he thinks it played in the development of the South African Jewish community. He makes the point that this was a very influential press. And in fact, the Yiddish press in South Africa preceded the English Jewish press, that it had a really, really wide reach and is an important source for us to understand the community. Another young scholar is Asher Lubotsky, who recently finished his PhD at Indiana University. He is Israeli, but based in the United States. And in his PhD, he's looking at the early relationship between the state of Israel and Southern Africa. And in his article for the special issue, which is really interesting, he looks at what he calls the other radicals. So instead of focusing on the radical Jewish activists who were active in the struggle against apartheid, he's interested in radical Jews who were involved in Zionist socialist youth movements. So again, an interesting, fresh perspective. Another scholar I'll mention who recently completed a PhD, this time at UCT, is David Fachler, who focuses on the development of Orthodox Jewry in South Africa, another neglected subject. And his article for our journal, he focused on the Kollel Yad Shaul, which officially launched in Johannesburg in the early 1970s. And it's a fascinating story because this Kollel drew a huge amount of interest, especially from young Jews, but also clashed in lots of ways with the mainstream Jewish authorities. And even though it gradually declined in influence, he argues that overall it had a very important impact on the development of orthodoxy in South Africa. So to close, maybe I will just say very briefly a little bit about my own work in this field, which I haven't mentioned so far, but is something that I've really devoted myself to after having started in quite a different field when I did my PhD and immediately afterwards, writing about music and the Holocaust. But I turned about 15 years ago to writing about South African Jews. In my early work, I looked at how the Holocaust has been remembered in South Africa and how South Africans of various kinds, both Jews and non-Jews, have drawn on the Holocaust in thinking about, trying to understand, commemorating apartheid. So, for example, I wrote articles about representations of Anne Frank, including early stagings of the play The Diary of Anne Frank in the 1950s in apartheid South Africa. What did that look like? all the way up to the Anne Frank in the World exhibition that I mentioned that traveled all over South Africa in the mid-1990s. And I've also looked at textbooks, how Nazism featured in South African textbooks since the 1950s. Again, you would think it wasn't there in apartheid South Africa, but actually it was quite extensively represented. On a different subject, I did a project with Professor Deborah Posel, who's now at the University of the Free State, a few years ago, in which we interviewed a cross-section of South African Jews who considered themselves to be on the left, broadly construed, who saw themselves as somewhat outside of the mainstream community, to understand how they defined their identities as Jews in South Africa, and specifically how they related to the Holocaust and Israel as South African Jews. And some very interesting things came out of that research project, but also generated some somewhat heated debates and conversations with audiences in South Africa. More recently, I've been working on German Jewish refugees who came to South Africa. I published a book titled From Things Lost in 2017, which was based on a huge trove, an amazing treasure trove of letters that was discovered in a garage in Johannesburg, as these things often are, written by and to a young German Jewish refugee who came to South Africa in 1936 and kept carbon copies of all of his letters, including the ones he wrote and the letters that he received. And I'm now working on an expanded project, also a book, which is looking at Jewish refugees from Nazism who came not only to South Africa, but to sub-Saharan Africa more broadly. So that also includes northern and southern Rhodesia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, and other places. I find it a totally fascinating story that I fell into because I found materials in the archive that led me to realize that many more refugees came than we thought. By my current count, it was at least 10,000 who came to sub-Saharan Africa, and at least 2/3 of whom stayed in Africa, which is quite different from the picture of transit that we see in other parts of the global south, like refugees who went to, say, India or even parts of Latin America. So I'm really interested in how these Jews experienced the encounter with Africa and how they engaged with these African societies over the longer term, how their presence, the presence of European Jews, impacted the development of these societies. And actually, this is something that I would really appreciate the input of this group on. Many of the refugees who first came to Central or Eastern or Southern Africa ended up in South Africa because they weren't allowed to remain in these mostly colonial territories after the war. So I would be super interested to hear if anybody has personal connections to refugees or perhaps could connect me with refugees' families. So given the time, I think I will end my overview there, but I'm very happy to answer your questions about anything I've raised. Very curious to hear your impressions about all the various subjects that are being researched.
Well, Shirley, you've given us a tour de force, really an amazing picture of what's been going on and, where the gaps are. And, it's been wonderful. Now, please raise your hand if you want to say something. Errol has been patiently waiting, so please unmute Errol so that you can ask your question or make your comments to Shirley.
Hi, Shirley. We met in LA when you gave a talk there. I have one question and one comment. I have not read anything about the history of the Durban Jewish community. Do you have any sources for me? And my comment is that reading about South African Jewish history, one reads a lot about the politicians and the attorneys and other professionals and very little about the doctors. And I've just come across a book that was published a year or two ago, not easy to get, published in Cape Town and not available on eBay or on Amazon. It's A Century of Achievement by Keane and Bremner. And it profiles a lot of doctors who we as physicians from South Africa knew, and a lot that we didn't know. And what's interesting about the book is that the authors identify the origins of the doctors or their parents. And looking through the index, I don't remember the exact number, about 25 to 33% of these famous doctors are from Lithuania or Latvia. So I just wanted to share that with you and hear your comments about Durban.
Thanks for the question. And yes, that was, I remember that talk well when I spoke at UCLA, and there was a contingent of South Africans. And I have to say, whenever I go to a different city, I was in Toronto last year, and it was lovely to have South African Jews there. This is a very far-flung diaspora, and it's wonderful that people are still engaged and interested. On the Durban Jewish community, yes. I just, as you were talking, was looking in my bibliography, but the bibliography is huge. I do remember off the top of my head, there were, may have been MA or PhD theses and possibly also a publication. I'd be very happy to email you the reference. How easy it will be to get hold of it, I don't know, but there have definitely been regional studies. There have been a surprising number of regional studies. I mean, one of the things that I did for the State of the Field article was just trawled to find everything I could relating to South African Jews. And there is a surprising number of academic studies that have been written about, like the Jews of Potchefstroom and the Jews of Pietermaritzburg. So I'm pretty sure there is something on Durban. And maybe if you Google me and look for my UCL page, you'll find my email address there. Just drop me a line and I can email you what I find in my bibliography. As to the doctors, and I assume the book that you're mentioning was not about Jewish doctors, it was just generally medical professionals, but the Lithuanian or Latvian origin suggests very clearly doctors. And yes, this has been mentioned by lots of people in passing in their writing or in these conversations. To my knowledge, there hasn't been extensive or systematic study of this subject. It is yet another, I mean, there are so many of these areas where we could be doing really fruitful research. And I've not seen very much, but again, I'll trawl the bibliography and see if I can direct you to anything.
Okay, maybe I could just make a comment about doctors. You know, I've been involved in the class of 60, the graduating medical class of Wits in 1960. In 2000, which was the 60th anniversary of their graduation, they looked at it and said, who are these people? And reached out to them. So we created a website, which is now actually going to be published as an ebook about the graduating class of 1960. But what we found there, which became clear, you were accepted at medical school on the basis of your matric results, basically. That was it. And of course, the Jewish boys did very well in their matric results. And in Ronnie's class, and my brother's class, which was the class of 1960, more than half the medical students were Jews. And, you know, this has led to the fact that South Africa could never have contained the talent that came out. And that was just 1 year. Out of that 1 year, 22 of the 85 or so graduates that year became professors of one kind or another. Some in South Africa, but of course in America, in Europe, in the UK. 3 became deans of medical schools. Well, one was a dean of a medical school in Johannesburg, but also at Mount Sinai in Philadelphia. You know, there was just so much talent that came out. And also South Africa did not have the resources for further training. So they had to go overseas. And once they went, they got jobs and they didn't go back. So the book that Keener has written, you know, has even got 3 or 4 of those 1960 graduates, but it's basically South African doctors and their contribution to medical positions in America. But so watch out for our ebook, which has got which I've re-edited the website into narratives. So we've talked about the schools they went to. There are links to the biographies of 50 doctors from that year, and etc. Memories of working at Baragwanath and all the Joburg Gen, etc., and their teachers. So sorry, that was an aside.
That's great. Thanks, Geraldine. And I wonder if I could just add something to what Errol was saying. And this is a shameless plug, but I do this in the service of South African Jewish history. The challenge right now is funding. If I can find young graduate students who would do this work, it's a wide open field. There's so much work to be done. We just need to get people to support doctoral scholarships. So if you know of foundations or trusts, it's not a massive amount of money to support one doctoral scholar to go through a program. I'm supervising already one student at the moment who's working on a fantastic study of Jewish women's relationships with their domestic workers in the domestic sphere. But there's, to the extent that we can get people in and support their research, we'll get the research done. It's just the funding that we need.
So how much, Shirley, do you need to help a student do a PhD? Because maybe this is something Hull can do. Maybe those medical graduates of 1960, we can make a little fund to do something.
Certainly, if we wanted to say we're really interested in a study of South African Jewish doctors, and we would have to, as an academic study, the person would need to have complete academic freedom to find what they find and say what they say. It wouldn't be just, a series of biographies. But that would be amazing. I can get the exact numbers for you, but it's like, I have in my head £60,000 to take a doctoral student through. It depends whether we're covering just tuition or also living fee, living expenses. I can get you that number.
Okay, well, we can look at a range of ways we could support. Maybe this is something that Hull should have as an aim to support scholarship.
It would be amazing. I mean, I want to encourage young scholars, and if we can say to them, come and write something and we'll give you money, that's the best incentive, because that's what they struggle with at the moment, of course.
Danielle, would you like to unmute him?
Yeah. Hello, Shirley. Hi.
Danielle is one of those who I've tried to encourage.
I know. Well, in fact, I'll come up and see you in the new year, if that's all right, and have a chat. But this may be too broad a question for now, but you talked about new source materials and you talked about questions that we should be asking. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, it's a broad question, but in general, what kind of questions are sort of outstanding and really need to be asked? I'm sure there's so many.
Yeah, there are gazillions of questions. So I think, where would I start? I would be interested in, first of all, in ordinary Jews. So a lot of the research is focused on prominent communal figures. What were ordinary Jews' experiences of life in South Africa? How did those experiences change as successive generations became more established? Women's experiences particularly, we know almost nothing. And it's very different. I mean, South Africa was, perhaps is still in many ways, a very patriarchal society. And Gavin's work on cookbooks has done a little to open that picture, but I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Sephardi Jews in South Africa, we know very little about Sephardi Jews. Jews' relationships with non-Jewish communities, with Afrikaners, with English-speaking whites, with various Black communities. We know almost nothing. The Kaplan Center has done a little bit of sociodemographic work to get a sense of what were Black perceptions of Jews in South Africa, what are Black perceptions of Jews in South Africa. But that's a huge subject. Even in studies of anti-Semitism, the excellent work that Milton Shane has done, he's focused mostly on Afrikaner anti-Semitism and to some extent on white anti-Semitism. And in his most recent book on Muslim anti-Semitism, which he considers the most problematic and threatening kind of anti-Semitism. But what about, the huge Black majorities' attitudes towards Jews? How did the social relationships between Jews and others change since the advent of democracy? This one is really interesting to me, I think. What has been the impact of South African Jews in the wider world? So, I've noticed that South African Jews are a very small community, but there are lots of prominent Jews in the larger Jewish sea who are of South African origin. That's another interesting, that's just a few. And if you look in the article, I've kind of enumerated a very long, boring list of all the areas where I feel like we could be looking. And we could be looking at memory. Why, for example, has the interest in Lithuania become such a big area of interest in the last 2 decades for South African Jews? Anyway, and there are lots more besides that.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Danielle. Errol, you wanted to come back with something?
Just related to what you were talking about, your husband Ronnie's class was a very special class. Our class, a class of 66, has got a very active website. And what came out recently was the attitude of Indians and non-whites to Jewish medical students that were repressed in our times, because there were always about 10% of our class at WITS, zero communication. And what our website has shown us since Gaza is how they felt about us. And I find that interesting. If I can try and make a shirach between our class website and your class website, you might find it interesting. And maybe that can be part of your effort to get some funding.
Yeah, we have mentioned your website in the book, so it will be there. So thanks. Raviva, if you'd like to unmute and also put your picture on, if you want to say something.
Hi, Geraldine. Hi, Shirley. Thanks for the talk, Shirley. I am, as a young researcher in this field, I'm interested in you expanding more on the topics that you started off with about the different types of research and research that has an agenda versus neutral, more pure academic, and what is the responsibility that young researchers in the field should have towards affecting community narratives, or how research that we undertake could be taken up by elements in society that perhaps are not sympathetic to the Jewish community and Jewish causes. Like what we're facing a lot at the moment is I haven't had to publish in this area, but even when I'm writing questions, is how I phrase the word Zionist. It used to be quite a neutral word, but today in South Africa, it's a bit of a dirty word. So we're finding other words like attachment to Israel, and I'm just wondering, how would you guide us young researchers in terms of our balancing act between undertaking rigorous, neutral, agenda-free analysis and the implications that can have on how the wider community view the Jewish community?
You hit the nail on the head in terms of the challenge. It is one that I am hugely sympathetic with, and I'm not sure I have an answer for you. It is a huge, huge issue. It's certainly one I've come across, but really peripherally. I am South African, but I live in London. I'm in a very different context, and I'm also a senior scholar with job security. So I think both being in South Africa and being a younger scholar brings so many challenges, but that in addition to this kind of just the core challenge that you outlined, which is, the rigorous academic research versus the agenda-driven research. And I think what I was alluding to when I said that I think in the case of South African Jews, this relationship is more complicated than it is with most, is exactly that. There are reasons why the South African Jewish community at present very justifiably feels like the way in which its history is narrated is not neutral, exactly like you've discovered. You know, you're operating in a frame where even the words that you use, it's, you know, it's not even a question of the arguments that you're making, but the words that you're using are going to be snapped up by people who will misquote it, misuse it.
Yes, exactly.
And, you know, I also alluded to this when I talked about the project that I did with Deborah Posel, but this was now, you know, 7 or 8 years ago. And this was the conversation that came out. Very, very angry people saying, how can you do this research? And part of what the research was finding was that South African Jews on the left were really struggling, were battling with feeling like they felt deeply connected to Israel, to their Jewish identity, but were struggling with what they were seeing happening in Israel and in the occupied territories. I mean, that was really the extent of it. It wasn't, you know, we weren't looking at radical Jews who were supporting BDS, because in that sense, those people's narratives were simple. We were interested in the Jews who were struggling. But even in the context of 7 or 8 years ago, when we presented this research, in Cape Town and in Johannesburg, people got very angry that we were airing the community's dirty laundry in public, that how can we even say that some Jews are struggling with these issues, because this is going to be snapped up by, you know, by people who hate us. And I get that. How do you balance it as a young researcher? I'm not sure. I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you specifically and, you know, your particular research. I think part of it, sadly, is to withdraw a little bit from the more controversial stuff in the interests of pursuing a career, if you want to pursue a career in Cape Town, and maybe choosing subjects that are going to be less controversial. But, you know, I think it's very difficult if you're wanting to do rigorous academic work and you come across a source where, you know, for example, as I do in my work, a German Jewish refugee who is talking in quite racist ways about Africa in the 1940s. Okay, that's a part of the history. It's interesting to me that someone who comes from Europe, where they were a victim of persecution, comes to South Africa and literally just doesn't clock any connection between what they've experienced and what they're seeing in South Africa. I'm interested in that, but do I want to say that Jews are racist? Of course not. So it's a very, very delicate balancing act. And I can absolutely see, and probably only see the tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg of how difficult it must be for someone like you working in South Africa. Although I should say that in the rest of the world, at least in the London part of the world, these days it feels like working on Jewish study, anything to do with Jewish studies is difficult. But let's have a longer conversation if that would be helpful, to think about how to.
Yeah, that'll be great. I look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Raviva and Shirley. Lynette, did you want to say something? And then I'll come to Charles Heller.
Yes.
You've got a physical hand.
Please. Shirley, tachlis now. How do you qualify a researcher? Because there's so many of us who write stories about family history and where we lived and development of our communities. What would you see as bottom line qualification? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And I wish there was a tachlis exact definition that I could give you. It's very, very blurry, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who are doing community research, public history, who are doing it in incredibly rigorous, systematic ways, who are using primary sources. You know, so the artificial definition would be to say those who have academic training, who have training in the requisite skills, methodologies, languages, who, you know, have training in reading secondary literature and synthesizing it, who have training in either how to seek out source materials. In my case, it would be archival materials as a historian, or who know how to do oral history interviews and who have training in analyzing them. So I'd probably use the artificial boundary of professional training as a researcher. But I would absolutely acknowledge that there are lots of varieties of that. There is certainly lots of research coming out of universities and other academic institutions these days, which I think is dire and is just a product of the publish or perish. And so people feel like they have to publish things even when they have nothing to say. And lots of people do terrible work. So I don't necessarily think that something coming out of university is better than some of the outstanding community research that is being done. So there's a very blurry line. I hope that's, I don't know, that's the best answer I can give you.
Thank you.
Good. Charles?
Thank you for allowing me to speak. And Shirley, I found your talk fascinating. It's the first time I've been on this Zoom, but what I wanted to talk about is the impact. Well, let me just give you a background. I came from a little town called Worcester, which is in the Boland, and we were in the milling industry. And when I was there with my family and so on, the milling industry in South Africa was predominantly dominated by Jews, whether it was in Pretoria, Johannesburg, all over South Africa. The Jewish community were very involved in milling, flour milling, processing grains and that type of thing. And is this worth pursuing? I'm not sure. I'm not an academic. I just wanted to bring it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm familiar with Worcester because I played in a piano competition there about 100 years ago. The Henny Hubert piano competition was in Worcester. So I have a very vivid picture in my head of Worcester. To answer your question, absolutely. I think the involvement of South African Jews in various parts of South African economy and industry is virtually unexplored, and it is something crucial. I mean, I also think it's one of the really interesting things about the South African Jewish community compared with other diaspora communities, particularly in Johannesburg. In other diaspora communities, you often see Jews arriving when, the communities they arrive into are already quite well established. In the case of particularly Johannesburg, Jews were part of building that city. They weren't just, kind of newcomers. They were part of the process of building those industries, that economy. So I absolutely think this is something that crucial that needs to be documented. And again, not just the contributions, not just here were all the different families who were involved in milling, but somebody who can look at that across the board and look at the preponderance of Jews and talk about how did their Jewishness impact how that industry developed. Probably it will have something to do, as it often does, with Jews' connections with one another, within the country, across the diaspora. But there may be other important ways in which the Jewishness of these milling families shaped the way in which the milling industry in South Africa developed. Amazing. That would be a brilliant research. Thanks.
It seems to me from the stories we get on the Chol website, and of course there are a load of memoirs, personal histories, but a lot are involved with agriculture. And it seems that in these small towns, it was the Jews who helped the farmers. They had the general stores. The farmers came and gave them their produce, and they gave them the goods they needed. They gave them extended credit. And that's how Jews, I think, got into agriculture. Some got into creating systems for water. I can't think of the word. Others dealt with farm implements and machinery. And this is, the agriculture itself, which I think milling is part of, would be you know, really interesting to see how they opened up the country for the farmers. They brought goods to them. They took their produce, you know, the Smos who went with his donkey cart came back with chickens and lambs. And so that's how the farmers progressed, really, in a barren, difficult situation.
And that, just to add to that part of the history, I think, also raises such interesting questions on that subject of Jews' relationships with their neighbors. You know, most of the research has looked at Jews in the cities, and most Jews lived in the cities, but in the rural areas, they were dealing with, unlike in the cities, they were mostly dealing with Afrikaans-speaking whites and a very different communities. So that's super interesting. One should mention here the amazing work done by Friends of Betat Futsot in South Africa on the Jews in the Country Communities project, a series of books, which are more in the public history realm, but have done a lot to document individual communities. But there's huge amounts of work still to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. And yeah, the Betat Futsot books are, you know, a real basis of history of these small communities. So thanks. So Gavin, would you like to unmute and talk to us?
Firstly, thank you, Shirley. That was so interesting. Just so useful, your article and this talk, to have this broad overview and ideas for future research. I just had a reflection on your conversation with Rebecca a second ago. There's a couple of things. I think that it's because of how difficult perhaps it is to do very honest, a controversial, difficult work in South Africa. Perhaps it's the responsibility of those of us who live outside South Africa and who are more secure either job-wise or culturally in terms of our community positionality, to do that kind of a little bit of airing the dirty laundry, a little bit of trying to get the community to reflect on some of the things that is particularly in the apartheid era that it is implicated in very deeply and personally and intimately. I'm about to say something maybe a little bit controversial, and everyone in this call, please consider yourself excluded from this broad generalization. But, you know, this is based on my own life experience as a South African Jew who grew up elsewhere. My sense is that maybe a lot of South African Jews outside of South Africa have a more have perhaps a less developed reconciliation with what happened during apartheid and how South African Jews were implicated in it than Jews in South Africa who have lived through the last 30 years of South African history and who have participated in their own lives in various forms of reconciliation. I think maybe Jews outside of South Africa have a more fossilized attitude to, or a more rosy attitude to, the apartheid years. And I personally see my audience maybe more as Jews outside of South Africa, to get them to think about those legacies. I think maybe that work is more needed for Jews outside of South Africa than inside. So I wonder what you think about that.
Really interesting thoughts. It does make me think that it would be interesting to convene a small group of people who are working in this area, because it's so politically charged, right? We're not just researchers. On the point of maybe it's the responsibilities of researchers outside South Africa, maybe I certainly think that's why there is more research outside South Africa, but I also think it's a question of infrastructure. Although I also think that I'm struck by the number of young researchers looking at this who are not South African, don't have South African roots or connections. And that may also be part of it, that maybe they're even not attuned to the kinds of political issues and controversies that their work might raise. As to Jews with a South African connection outside the country, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, it's something that's come up in Louise Leibowitz's research. This is the PhD student I mentioned who's looking at relationships between domestic workers and Jewish women and their domestic workers during apartheid. And she's been interviewing Jewish women in South Africa, but also Jewish women who are now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, who are in South Africa, but also in Australia, the UK, the United States, and Israel. And there's very interesting ways in which not just the fact of immigration, but the place where they've ended up informs how they think about apartheid, how they've reconciled their own, positioning in it or not in it, it's fascinating. I would say again that this is probably an interesting subject for research. I mean, I have my own anecdotal impressions based on people that I've spoken to, and it does feel quite different depending on where in the world you go. Like the UK Jewish community feels much more connected to South Africa even now than, for example, South African Jews that I've engaged with in parts of the US where I've been. And Israel puts its own very different take on things. Australia, I don't have much contact with. Yeah, but that's a fascinating question. Thank you.
Thanks. There's also the question of South African Jews and Blacks, because the Smoses also dealt with Blacks, and there's also the whole picture of South African Jews running concession stores. Now, in my little deliberations, I think I sent around in one of our whole newsletters, finding out how Basutu blankets are a Jewish invention. And finding out that, Mr. Gross became a friend of the Basutu chiefs, and he was at the wedding of his son. And, they were cold. And they were having karosses and things. And then there was the rinderpest, and there weren't so many animals to make karosses. And he had connections with a part of his family who ran the Waverley Blanket Company in Cape Town. And he designed these fancy things and got them made up and sold. And of course, they were the big thing in all the concession stores. So, something that we take for granted, as I always say, you have to chercher le juif. You've got to find the Jew behind all these little things that you find. So there's another bit of research for somebody. Errol, you wanted to come back with something again? You have to unmute.
Listening to Gavin's comment, you might not want to go to the farmers of South Africa because of the dirty laundry that Gavin mentioned. I mean, that would help open up this whole question of the use of prison labor in the Eastern Transvaal. And that would be very painful and maybe dangerous for whoever's researching that.
But it may not be a Jewish thing. It may be something that was available.
But the majority of the potato farmers were Jewish.
Well, I think that it's very interesting to know about the potato farmers, but, the idea of using prison labor was probably not a Jewish invention. It was something that they could take advantage of.
As a researcher, I can see that being really interesting to see what those connections are. And I probably, in the current political climate, wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. Because even here, we operate in a political climate, I think, which are the particular topics we take on. I don't know, we also have to present them with a zillion caveats, and I do at least.
Great. Well, I think you've stirred a lot of interest, Shirley, and, people are fired up. So we can do two things. We can suggest topics, we can provide source material, and hopefully we could also find a little bit of money to support scholars, whether they're in South Africa or somewhere else, researching South African history. You know, sometimes even say £2,500 can help somebody, you know, tip the balance between whether they go and do a PhD or not. So if we shouldn't be daunted by huge amounts of money, but I'd be interested if anybody wants to email me and say, look, I'm prepared to make a contribution. And, you know, maybe this is something that Hull can help with. We also, in the memoirs, have a lot of you know, first-hand primary source material. So, you know, you can guide people there to look at that stuff. And we're also interested to know what you'd like as another series of seminars. We haven't had, you know, maybe we can have a series on Jews in agriculture and so, you know, we've had Jews in music. So, you know, let me know what you think we might do in the spring or so. And we look forward to seeing you again. So Shirley, thank you so much for suggesting the series, for curating it. Thank you also to Gavin and Reviva who've been on this session, and hope you'll continue to join us on Hull. And, you know, wherever you see that Hull can run, flow, you know, we're happy to follow your flow. It's a platform. It's, you know, it doesn't have its own agenda. Its agenda is to support your wishes and your ideas. And that's how we go. So Ralph, could you say something, because you said your dad was a small town miller and you'd like to do a project on that subject, including farmers.
Sure. It was in response to Charles. I didn't realize that the Jews were so involved in milling in South Africa, but my father was. His partner was as well. They both came from Latvia. And they employed prison work. I remember, I think it was 50 cents per day per person, but it was available to anyone who wanted that. And I have an anecdote. When they arrived in, we came from a little town called Vryheid in Natal, and his first job was at a concession store on one of the mines, and him and his boss, and I just cannot remember his boss for now, but they could only speak Yiddish. They couldn't speak Zulu or anything. And in order to communicate, they taught the locals Yiddish. So the locals who bought from them came in and spoke to them in Yiddish. So at one point, there was a little community outside Vryheid who spoke Yiddish, and they were the Zulus.
That's wonderful. So, you know, have a word with Shirley and see if she can set you up doing your research
Sure.
on millers. And so thank you so much to everybody. I will circulate the link, Shirley, to the journal, to everybody on the list, whether they were here or not. Shirley's put it in the link for those of you who'd like to do it straight away. So copy that link. It's all open access. You should be able to download the PDFs or read it online. Feel free to email Shirley. Again, you know, you can do that through me. I can facilitate, you know, meeting each other. We had this interactive list, but some people really freaked out about it, so we had to stop it. I'd be very happy to start an interactive list. Maybe what I'll do is I'll ask everybody on the general list who'd like to be on it, and then you can talk to each other, because I see that as instant research where you can talk to each other and find out things and somebody can answer, etc. So I'll try and do that. So is anybody
well
else?
done, Geraldine.
Thank you, Lynette. It's nice to hear that. Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Reviva, for the session. Thanks to everybody who's come along to listen. And we look forward to meeting again when we've thought of something else to do in the new year. So happy Christmas to everybody and Hanukkah, and all the best until we see you again.
Thank you, Geraldine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you all for coming.
Okay.
Right. Where do I, where,